Edith Boulogne looked at the newspaper photo of the little boy with her son's eyes and knew instantly. This was her grandchild. When she told Alain Delon she was going to adopt Ari, his response was cold and brutal. Choose between that bastard child and your son. What happened next would haunt their family forever. But to understand the tragedy that would tear apart one of France's most famous families, we must first understand the desperate attempts by an innocent man to prove his truth and the systematic obstruction that would destroy 3 generations of lives. The photograph that appeared in François on a gray November morning in 1964 showed a 2-year-old boy with unmistakable features. The same piercing blue eyes, the distinctive bone structure, and that particular way of tilting his head that anyone who knew the Delon family would immediately recognize. For Edith Boulogne, seeing that image was like looking at a photograph of her famous son as a child. I said to myself, that is my son's child, she would later recall, the memory still painful decades afterward. The resemblance was so striking that she felt an immediate maternal pull toward this little boy, who had been dragged around Europe by his troubled mother, living in train stations and airport hotels, surviving on nothing but French fries and the chaos of Nico's unstable lifestyle. What the world did not know, and what would remain hidden for decades, was that Alain Delon had been fighting desperately to establish the truth about Ari's parentage, from the moment he learned of the child's existence. Far from being the heartless father who simply abandoned his responsibility, Delon had immediately sought scientific proof through the most advanced testing available in 1962. I want a blood test, he had told Nico repeatedly, during those crucial early months. If this child is mine, I will take full responsibility. But I will not be trapped by accusations without proof. His position was logical, reasonable, and entirely consistent with someone who genuinely believed he was not the father. But what Alain's mother did not know was that her son had desperately tried to prove the truth through DNA testing, only to be blocked by the one person who could have ended the mystery. Nico's response to Delon's requests for scientific verification revealed the first cracks in her story. Instead of welcoming the opportunity to prove her claims and secure support for her child, she became evasive, defensive, and ultimately hostile to any suggestion of testing. Her behavior suggested someone who had something to hide rather than someone confident in the truth of her accusations. The legal and medical establishment in 1962 France was not equipped to handle such complex paternity questions. Blood typing could exclude potential fathers but could not definitively establish paternity. And the sophisticated DNA testing that would later revolutionize such cases was still years away from practical application. This technological limitation created an impossible situation for everyone involved. Nico could make accusations that could not be definitively disproven, while Alain could maintain his innocence without being able to provide absolute scientific proof. The child, meanwhile, remained caught in the middle of an adult conflict that would shape his entire life. When Edith Boulogne saw that newspaper photograph and felt the immediate conviction that this was her grandchild, she was responding to a powerful combination of maternal instinct and visual evidence that seemed overwhelming. The resemblance was so strong that even strangers often commented on it, and the emotional pull of seeing a small child apparently abandoned by his famous father created an irresistible urge to intervene. Her decision to contact Nico and arrange to meet the child was made with the best of intentions, driven by a grandmother's love and a sense of family responsibility that transcended the complicated adult conflicts surrounding Ari's parentage. When she first saw the little boy in person, running into her husband's arms with the natural trust of a child desperate for stability, she was completely convinced that this was her son's child who needed protection and care. The confrontation between Edith and Alain that followed would become legendary in its brutality and pain. When she announced her intention to adopt Ari and provide him with the stable family life he desperately needed, Alain's response was immediate and devastating. You will choose between that child and your son. The ultimatum was not issued out of cruelty or indifference to the child's welfare, but out of Alain's profound frustration at being unable to prove his innocence and his fury at being forced to accept responsibility for a child he genuinely believed was not his. From his perspective, his own mother was choosing to believe accusations over her own son's word, and was essentially calling him a liar. As Edith made her heartbreaking decision to adopt Ari, she had no idea she was about to punish an innocent man for 17 years. The family meeting that would decide Ari's fate took place in the elegant sitting room of the Boulogne family, home with all the formality of a business negotiation, but carrying the emotional weight of 3 lives hanging in the balance. Edith and her husband Paul had already made their decision, but they hoped that presenting Alain with the reality of the situation would soften his position. "Look at him," Edith pleaded, as 2-year-old Ari played quietly in the corner. "Look at his eyes, his expressions. How can you deny what is so obvious to everyone who sees him?" But for Alain, the physical resemblance that convinced others only intensified his sense of being trapped in an impossible situation. The scientific proof he had sought remained elusive, blocked by Nico's refusal to cooperate and the limitations of 1960s technology. The child's welfare demanded immediate action, but accepting responsibility without proof felt like surrendering to false accusations that could define the rest of his life. When Alain begged his mother one final time to wait for scientific proof, her response would destroy their relationship and break his heart forever. "Your famous career means more to you than this innocent child," Edith said with cold finality. "If you cannot accept what is so obvious to everyone who has eyes, then you are not the son I raised." With those words, she chose to believe accusations over her own child's desperate pleas for understanding. The irony was devastating. A mother who had always prided herself on unconditional love for her family was now withdrawing that love from the very son who needed it most, all in the name of protecting a child who might not even belong to their family. But Edith's decision was made with the absolute conviction that comes from maternal instinct, and no amount of reasoning could shake her belief that she was doing the right thing. What followed was a campaign of systematic exclusion that would have broken a lesser man's spirit completely. Alain found himself cut off from his own mother, denied access to family gatherings, and forced to watch from a distance as the woman who had given him life chose to invest her love and resources in raising someone else's child. The practical consequences of this family split extended far beyond hurt feelings and wounded pride. Alain lost not only his relationship with his mother, but also his connection to family traditions, childhood memories, and the sense of belonging that had sustained him through the challenges of building his career. He was, in effect, orphaned by his own family's decision to believe accusations rather than trust his word. But the emotional toll was even more devastating than the practical losses. Every birthday that passed without contact, every holiday spent in isolation from his family, every newspaper article that portrayed him as a heartless father who had abandoned his child added another layer to the pain of being misunderstood and wrongly accused. What made the situation even more unbearable was Alain's complete inability to defend himself publicly. Any attempt to explain his position would be seen as attacking an innocent child or a grieving mother, and the entertainment press had no interest in complex explanations when simple narratives of celebrity scandal were so much more compelling. What the world did not know was that Alain had been fighting for years to prove his innocence, while being painted as a heartless father who abandoned his child. Behind the scenes, away from the public eye and media speculation, Alain continued his desperate attempts to establish the scientific truth that would vindicate his position. He consulted with legal experts about the possibility of court-ordered paternity testing, only to be told repeatedly that such procedures required the cooperation of all parties involved. Nico's continued refusal to submit herself or agree to any form of scientific testing became increasingly suspicious as the years passed. Her explanations for this refusal evolved from claiming that such tests were unnecessary because the truth was obvious, to suggesting that they would be traumatic for the child, to finally maintaining a stubborn silence on the entire subject. For someone who claimed to want recognition and support for her child, her systematic blocking of every avenue that could have provided definitive proof seemed contradictory and increasingly difficult to explain. But without her cooperation, Alain remained trapped in a situation where he could not prove his innocence, despite his absolute conviction that he was not Ari's father. The legal system of 1960s France offered no relief for men in his position. Paternity laws were designed primarily to ensure that children received financial support, with relatively little consideration for the rights of men who genuinely believed they were being falsely accused. The burden of proof required to challenge paternity claims was so high as to be practically impossible to meet without the accuser's cooperation. As the years passed and Ari grew from a toddler into a young man, the physical resemblance that had convinced Edith remained strong enough to reinforce public belief in Delon's paternity. Every photograph of the boy that appeared in newspapers showed features that could plausibly belong to the Delon family, making Alain's protestations of innocence seem increasingly hollow to outside observers. The entertainment press, always eager for ongoing celebrity drama, regularly revisited this story with articles about Ari's development, his relationship with his adoptive grandmother, and speculation about when or whether Alain would finally acknowledge his son. Each of these articles reopened the wound for Alain, reminding him of his powerlessness to control the narrative surrounding his own life. The professional consequences of being labeled as a deadbeat father were subtle but persistent. While his career continued to flourish based on his artistic achievements, there was always an undercurrent of moral judgment that affected how he was perceived by colleagues, critics, and audiences. The image of the sophisticated European actor was complicated by the suggestion that he lacked basic human decency in his personal relationships. But perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire situation was watching Ari grew up believing that his biological father had simply chosen to reject him. The psychological damage being inflicted on an innocent child by the adults, inability to resolve their conflicts, was heartbreaking for everyone involved. But Alain felt powerless to intervene without proof that would be accepted by all parties. But the most tragic part was still coming, the moment when the truth would finally surface, but far too late to heal the damage. His attempts to maintain some form of indirect contact with Ari through intermediaries were consistently blocked by the protective wall that Edith and, later, Nico's associates had built around the boy. Any gifts, letters, or attempts at communication were returned unopened or simply disappeared without acknowledgement. The 17 years of silence that followed Edith's ultimatum were marked by an ongoing campaign of character assassination that Alain endured with dignity but which took an enormous toll on his emotional well-being. He was forced to watch his reputation as a man be destroyed while his career as an actor continued to flourish, creating a strange disconnect between his public success and private anguish. If you believe that innocent people deserve to have their truth heard, subscribe to witness how this heartbreaking family story finally found its resolution. The breaking point came not from any dramatic confrontation or legal proceeding, but from a simple phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end belonged to a man who claimed to have information that would finally, after nearly 2 decades, provide the proof that Alain had been seeking since 1962. For 17 years, Alain lived with the pain of being called a deadbeat father, until the day a phone call revealed the shocking truth that vindicated him completely. For 17 years, Alain lived with the pain of being called a deadbeat father, until the day a phone call revealed the shocking truth that vindicated him completely. The voice on the other end belonged to Jean-Marc Billancourt, a French civil servant whose conscience had finally overcome his fear, and whose confession would expose one of the most elaborate cases of mistaken identity in entertainment history. "Monsieur Delon," the trembling voice began, "I am calling because I can no longer live with what I know. I am the real father of irreversible, and I have been a coward for allowing you to suffer from my actions." The words hit Alain like a physical blow, not because they were shocking, but because they confirmed what he had known in his heart for nearly 2 decades. Jean-Marc Billancourt's story was both simple and devastating in its implications. In 1961, he had been working as a civil servant in Paris when people began commenting on his remarkable resemblance to the rising movie star Alain Delon. The similarity was so striking that strangers would stop him on the street, asking for autographs and photographs, convinced they had encountered the famous actor. What began as amusing coincidence evolved into something more deliberate when Billancourt realized that this resemblance could open doors that would otherwise remain closed to a modest government employee. He began frequenting the sophisticated nightclubs and artistic circles where a man who looked like Alain Delon would be welcomed and celebrated. It was in one of these establishments that he encountered Nico, the stunning German model and singer who was already gaining recognition in European artistic circles. When she approached him with obvious interest, he made a decision that would haunt 3 families for decades. He allowed her to believe that he was actually Alain Delon. The resemblance was so perfect that even people who knew Alain personally were sometimes fooled, Billancourt explained during that devastating phone call. Nico was convinced she was having an affair with France's most promising actor, and I was too enchanted by her beauty and too intoxicated by the lifestyle to correct her mistake. The affair that followed was passionate but brief, lasting only a few weeks before Billancourt's conscience and fear of discovery ended the deception. When he told Nico his true identity, hoping she would understand and forgive the romantic fantasy they had shared, her response was complete denial and fury. The revelation that emerged would prove Alain had been innocent all along, but the cost of this delayed truth would be more devastating than anyone could have imagined. "She refused to believe me," Billancourt continued, his voice heavy with decades of guilt. "When I showed her my identification, when I explained that I was just a civil servant who happened to resemble Alain Delon, she became hysterical. She accused me of lying, of trying to avoid responsibility, of being a coward who was abandoning her now that she was pregnant. Miko's psychological investment in believing she had been romanced by a movie star was so complete that accepting the truth would have meant acknowledging that she had been deceived by someone she considered beneath her social station. The fantasy of being connected to Alain Delon, of having his child, of being part of France's entertainment aristocracy, was too valuable to surrender for the mundane reality of a government worker's accidental deception. When Billancourt made desperate attempts to take responsibility for the child after Ari's birth, Nico's response was to disappear completely, taking the baby and moving between different countries to avoid contact with the man she now viewed as an imposter and destroyer of her dreams. "I tried to find them," Billancourt explained. "I wanted to support my son, to be part of his life, to tell the truth about his parentage. But she had resources and connections that I could never match. She could hide anywhere in Europe, and I was just a civil servant with limited means to pursue them." The systematic campaign to maintain the fiction of Alain Delon's paternity became Nico's primary obsession. Every interview, every conversation with friends or associates, every legal document related to Ari's welfare, reinforced the claim that France's most famous actor was the boy's father. The lie became so central to her identity that abandoning it would have meant restructuring her entire sense of self. Meanwhile, Alain's repeated requests for scientific testing were consistently blocked, not because Nico feared the results, but because she knew exactly what those results would reveal. Her refusal to cooperate was not the behavior of someone confident in her claims, but the desperate defensive actions of someone protecting an elaborate fiction. When I saw Alain Delon being portrayed in the press as a heartless father, Billancourt said, his voice breaking when I watched him lose his relationship with his own mother because of my cowardice when I saw that innocent child growing up believing he had been rejected by his famous father. I knew I had committed a crime worse than simple deception. But you have not heard the most heartbreaking part yet. What happened when Alain finally tried to reconcile with his family? The evidence that Billancourt provided during that phone call was overwhelming and undeniable. He had preserved photographs from the 1960s that showed his remarkable resemblance to young Alain Delon, documentation of his employment and residence during the crucial period, and most importantly, detailed knowledge of intimate moments with Nico that only the real father could have possessed. When scientific DNA testing finally became available and reliable, Billancourt immediately volunteered to provide samples that would definitively establish his paternity. The results, when they came back weeks later, confirmed what he had been trying to tell the world for nearly 2 decades. He was Ari's biological father, and Alain Delon had been completely innocent all along. The vindication should have been a moment of triumph, a restoration of reputation and family relationships that had been destroyed by decades of false accusations. Instead, it became the source of an even deeper tragedy, because the 2 people who most needed to hear this truth were no longer alive to receive it. When Alain finally had proof of his innocence, he rushed to tell the 3 most important people in his life, but tragically, 2 of them would never hear his vindication. The phone call with Jean-Marc Billancourt had ended at 3:47 p.m. on a gray Tuesday in March of 2019, and within minutes, Alain was in his car, driving toward his mother's house with the DNA results that would prove he had been telling the truth for nearly 6 decades. But when he arrived at the familiar address where Edith Boulogne had spent her final years, he found only silence and the painful realization that he was too late. His mother had passed away just 2 months earlier, having lived her entire final decades believing that her famous son was a heartless father who had abandoned his child. She died still convinced that she had made the right choice in 1962, still proud of having saved an innocent grandchild from rejection. Standing in the empty house where he had spent his childhood, holding scientific proof that would have changed everything, Alain experienced a grief so profound that he later described it as, "The moment I understood that being right means nothing if the people who needed to hear it are gone forever." The second devastating blow came when he attempted to contact Ari, hoping that at least he could finally establish a relationship with the young man who had grown up believing himself rejected. But what he discovered was a broken soul in the final stages of drug addiction, living in a Paris apartment that had become a monument to decades of psychological damage. Ari Boulogne, at 57 years old, was barely recognizable as the beautiful child who had once played in Edith's garden. The years of heroin abuse, the psychological trauma of believing himself abandoned by his famous father, and the chaos of growing up with Miko had taken a toll that no amount of truth could repair. "I always wondered," Ari whispered during their only face-to-face meeting, his voice barely audible. Deep in my heart, I always wondered if you were telling the truth. But wondering and knowing are different things, and by the time I was old enough to seek real answers, it felt too late to matter. The ultimate irony was cruel beyond words. Alain Delon had been right all along, but the people who needed to hear his vindication were gone forever. What followed was a heartbreaking attempt to build some form of relationship with a man whose life had been destroyed by the very lie that had torn their family apart. Alain offered medical treatment, rehabilitation, financial support, everything he could think of to help Ari recover from decades of damage. But the truth had come too late to heal wounds that had been festering since childhood. I understand now that you never rejected me, Ari said during one of their last conversations. But understanding doesn't erase a lifetime of feeling unwanted. I spent 60 years believing that my own father looked at me and chose not to love me. That kind of pain doesn't disappear just because we discover it was based on a lie. The 4 years that followed were marked by Alain's desperate attempts to make up for lost time, while watching helplessly as Ari continued to deteriorate despite every medical intervention and therapeutic approach they tried. The psychological damage inflicted by decades of believing himself rejected proved to be irreversible, and the drugs that had been his escape from that pain had taken hold too completely to release him. Alain found himself in the impossible position of finally having the relationship he had been denied, but with a son who was too damaged to fully embrace it. Every moment they shared was tinged with the tragedy of what might have been if the truth had emerged decades earlier. But the most devastating moment was when investigators found Ari's final letter, written just before his death, containing words that would haunt Alain forever. The letter, discovered in Ari's apartment after his overdose in 2023, contained a confession that completed the circle of tragic irony that had defined their entire relationship. In shaky handwriting that revealed the depth of his physical and emotional deterioration, Ari had written, I know now that my real father was a coward named Jean-Marc who let an innocent man suffer for his mistakes. I know that Alain Delon spent 60 years being punished for telling the truth. I know that my grandmother chose to believe a lie rather than trust her own son. But knowing these things doesn't change the fact that I grew up feeling rejected and unwanted. Truth doesn't heal old wounds, it only shows us how unnecessary they were. The letter continued with words that would echo in Alain's mind for the rest of his life. I don't blame anyone anymore. Not Nico for protecting her fantasy. Not Edith for choosing compassion over skepticism. Not Jean-Marc for being afraid, and not Alain for being unable to prove his innocence when proof was impossible. I only wish the truth had come sooner, when it might have mattered enough to save us all. When Alain raid. Those words sitting alone in his study with the DNA evidence that had arrived decades too late, he understood that vindication without the people who needed to hear, it was not vindication at all, it was simply another form of isolation. The final cruel irony was that Alain Delon, who had spent his entire career playing mysterious and misunderstood characters, found himself living exactly such a role in his personal life. He was the man who had been right all along, who had suffered for decades because of other people's lies and mistakes, but who discovered that being proven correct meant nothing when delivered to empty rooms and silent graves. His final years were spent not celebrating his vindication, but mourning the family relationships that could have been salvaged if truth had arrived when it might have mattered. The scientific evidence that should have restored his reputation became instead a bitter reminder of how justice delayed becomes justice denied. When reporters asked him about the DNA results that proved his innocence, his response was simple and heartbreaking. I spent 60 years waiting for this moment. Alain Delon's story proves that being right isn't always enough. Sometimes the truth comes too late to heal the hearts that needed it most. Did this heartbreaking tale of delayed vindication touch your soul? Subscribe for more incredible stories of truth, justice, and the price of being misunderstood. If you believe innocent people deserve our compassion, hit that like button